Hello, and welcome back to Wes and the Historian. Today, I'd like to talk about a book that I read a few months ago titled America's British Culture by Russell Kirk. Now, if you can't tell by the flag in the background, I am part English, so this caught my attention, and I am also someone who is very interested in the culture of America and the high culture of America and defining what it even is to be American and what the culture of America even is. So, in that sense, I was interested in this book in seeing what the author had to say. And I should clarify, Russell Kirk was he was a important American conservative type. Um, so, I went into this knowing that that was the kind of perspective I was going to be getting. However, I was a little surprised by how um, how much he disregards uh, the 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 true revolutionary nature of America in its founding. So, a thing that I've noticed on the right side of the political spectrum, specifically with the more mainstream conservative types, maybe not necessarily like MAGA type people, but you do see the sentiment on the Republican um, side of the aisle where American conservatives try to claim the American Revolution. And not only do they try to claim it, but they essentially try to claim that it was never a liberal revolution. It was never really a revolution, it was more like a reaction. It was never actually this, to modern historians, they would say that, yeah, that was essentially like almost a left wing. That was the 1700s equivalent of the left wing attacking, the traditional conservative monarchy. And there is this trend among Republican Americans to kind of pretend like that's not true. And they try to act like actually the revolutionaries were just reactionaries, um, which can be true in some cases when you look at the history of how the colonies developed, which is essentially that they already had this kind of laissez-faire system where the government of Britain didn't really exert much influence over the colonies, so they did their own thing, and then all of a sudden they come in and start taxing people, and people get mad and they try to overthrow the government. However, when you simplify it like that, you're pretending as if as if the revolution never happened, as if this vision for America never existed at all. And as if from the get go, they were like, all right, we're just going to reestablish what everything was like before. And that's not at all the case when you look at the vision for America, because the founding fathers had a very forward thinking and very revolutionary vision that was shared by some of their less well-read counterparts who were actually fighting in the revolution. Um, and and you see this really revolutionary, there was this very dramatic change in American society during and after the revolution. It was not just a conservative reaction. And that is, in this book, America's British Culture, I don't remember if he explicitly says that, but it is like kind of this hinted at that that might be his position. And I just think that's a rather silly position. Um, in that, I do not think it's appropriate to pretend like the American Revolution was like a conservative revolution, because it really wasn't. It was a revolution in every sense of the term. I mean, the American Revolution inspired the French Revolution, um, and it's rather bizarre to me that American Republicans have tried to pretend that that's not what it was, and yeah, so. But in this America's British Culture, he essentially tries to argue that everything about America even after the revolution, essentially has its roots in Britain, and this is also true to an extent. However, he also completely leaves out, not only does he leave out, but he disparages the French influence on America. So, as many of you may know, France was our first military ally. They were not the first country to officially recognize the United States of America. However, they were the first to provide us ample support, and without the French, our nation likely would not even exist at all. Um, they provided enormous support, and not only that, but even aside from the military support, France exerted an immense influence on the cultural and intellectual sphere of America. So, a lot of these philosophers, a lot of figures like, let's say, Thomas Jefferson, for example, and Benjamin Franklin, were very, very influenced by the French, and specifically the French Enlightenment thinkers, especially Montesquieu and Voltaire, um, to the extent that, I mean, in every sense of the term, these people were Francophiles. And it was a period, the era of good feelings, which was after the War of 1812, where French cuisine and French literature and French culture in general really started to take off all over America. It was as if Americans were taking French culture and claiming it as their own, and they were using French culture to celebrate their own Americanness, because the, they wanted to define themselves as not English. They wanted to say, we have revolted against the English, and even though we consider ourselves a part of the same kin as the English in some sense of the term, we are legally and politically split off from them, and we don't necessarily want to be associated with that part of ourselves. So you see this revolutionary tendency where it was still very popular to learn French after the American Revolution, which of course it was the same in England, but still. And there was also, after the American Revolution, you see the introduction of the suffix "ville" at the end of city names, like Nashville, Knoxville, things like that. Um, and that is very French. That is a very French thing to do. You don't see this in England as much. And at this point, it's actually so popular in America that it's become kind of a stereotype. When people make jokes about, somewheresville in America, that's what they're saying, is they're kind of mocking it because it's such an American thing, but it comes from France. So ultimately, my whole point in making this video is that I do not think America's British Culture by Russell Kirk gave an honest view of America, but in America's real culture, which honestly, as English as we are, we also have so much that we have learned from the French. And I think that this actually is a part of our culture which has been underemphasized since for a very long time, which is bizarre considering, how much of American culture comes from. I mean, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France, and and still the French influence on America is so underemphasized, which is, I think, a great shame because to be an American meant to be a Francophile before the Civil War at least, and that was how it was during the era of good feelings. It was how it was during the American Revolution. Um, so really, we do have a lot that we owe to the French, and so much of our culture comes from the French. But what does that actually mean for our country? Because the Russell Kirk, he wrote this book with an ideological intention. He wanted you to know that all of the they didn't have the term woke back then, but I'm sure if Russell Kirk was around right now, he'd probably say it a lot. But there was this intention in his book to essentially combat this trend among education, especially higher education in the universities, to underemphasize our Englishness and to overemphasize like our cultural diversity and and authors and writers from around the world, uh, and especially countries outside of the West, and to emphasize perspectives that are not Western. So his goal in writing this book was to show, like, no, America is in every fundamental sense English. And I just want to push back against that and say that I think that honestly, to be American means to be a certain extent a Francophile. Um, and what is the significance of that? Well, that ultimately means that, in a weird sense, the French and their authors, especially the Enlightenment authors, are a part of our cultural canon. America has its roots in England, but ultimately there is so much that we have borrowed from Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau that I think these are figures who we really do need to emphasize more so in America and American education and culture. So that was essentially the point of this video. I find America and our cultural identity very interesting, and I think our Frenchness, or rather our Francophilia, to be a very interesting aspect of our culture. And I disliked that in this book he tries to undermine that or underplay it. If you read it, it actually is quite weird. I mean, he's just straight up insults Thomas Jefferson at several points, and tries to insult the revolutionaries who tried to make America more French, because there was a very strong push for that in America, to essentially make America like a second France, because these people were so heavily influenced by French culture and especially the Enlightenment. And he straight up insults these people, and it's very weird because those were the regular Americans. These were like, I mean, this was Thomas Jefferson, and this was James Monroe. These were the Democratic Republicans. These were the regular, common, everyday Americans, as opposed to like these, more mercantile elites living in New England who favored England, or living in New England who favored England. So yeah, I wanted to push back against the message of this book, because I think that America's Francophilia is a very interesting aspect of our culture, and we do need to emphasize it, in my opinion. I think that uh, I don't know. I have a great appreciation for French culture as well, and I think that America and France are tied together in a way that our relationship with Britain is not. We have the same, cultural fabric as England. We have the same ancestors, perhaps, but ultimately, so much of America's culture is defined as a reaction against the English, as opposed to being a part of the English space. So that's essentially everything I had to say about the matter. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.